All right, so we have Perry Muckerheide back on the program today to talk about a very impactful manuscript that you're covering, basically your effort, tremendous effort, to put together a 1990 tribute to John on his 50th birthday for John Lennon. And this is quite the tale. There's a lot of twists and turns here, but I think you do an excellent job in writing this and just calling out how significant it is that, we had this concert for George, and this has become such a staple for every artist. And here you are in 1990 engaging Michael Jackson, George Martin, right? Cynthia Lennon, who you travel with for quite a bit of time, as we'll get into. Basically, it was all coming together and there was a ton of momentum. And it's just an incredible, harrowing story that I was not as familiar with until I read this. Thrilled to have you on here to talk about it in more detail. Maybe starting off, what was your motivation to finally get this story down to paper? Why do you think this is the right time?
I thought it's been 35 years. Number one. And I've always thought, I've always waited for the story just to come out on its own. And it just never did. And I've always thought about it, and people would ask me, but it occurred to me that it would be great to write it down, but I never got around to it. And then a friend of mine in California, a gentleman named Harvey Silver, and I were talking, and he asked those same questions, and I started telling him little bits and pieces. And he said, "Wow, man, you should write that down." And so I decided to do it. It took me about a summer to get through the whole part of it, and it breaks down into three parts, two of which are ready for you to read, and for anybody listening to go to mybeatlesstory.com, and you'll find that they're available there. They're in their manuscript form. They're talking about publishing and so forth, but it's really verbatim the experience as I remember having it. And it was quite the adventure, of course. I luckily had a friend who had money and was willing to, say, "Look, go see what you can do, and I'll take care of the cost." So that opportunity doesn't come to many people. His gentleman, for the record, was a gentleman named Robert Messenger. What happened was 1990 was coming, and would have been John Lennon's 50th birthday and the 10th anniversary of his assassination. And nothing had been done. There was the enormous outpouring of thousands and thousands of people surrounding the Dakota the night it happened and the day after it happened. And eventually Yoko authorized the implanting of the Strawberry Fields medallion near the entrance to the Central Park nearest the Dakota, which was wonderful. And I've been there, and it's an ongoing ad hoc Beatles fan gravity point center. And you'll find people there always talking about John, talking about the music. You'll always find guitarists and little groups playing songs, and it's kind of an ongoing tribute. And of course, John will be dead now 45 years this year, and he would have been 85 this year. And of course, so John goes on and his music goes on, but there's never been a tribute concert of any kind, an event where his friends, performing friends, and people who were influenced by him would come together and celebrate his music and his life. And so anyway, 10 years was coming up in 1990. So I always thought the most dramatic thing would be a pop symphonic tribute, classical orchestra that would play with contemporary artists. And I also thought if you brought the orchestra in, that so much of the industry had gotten into dance, Michael Jackson and Madonna and on and on and on, Paula Abdul. And if you're going to bring the orchestra in, bring them in and combine them with popular artists or rock and roll artists, then why not bring some of the great popular dancers together with a ballet company? And I thought most immediately that Michael Jackson, who had really made his career equally about dance as it was about music, was really soaring in the late 80s. And I thought, wow, it would be great for him to dance with the most profound, legendary classical dancer. And at the time, Rudolf Nureyev was that, Mikhail Baryshnikov, but that really is a second generation, protege even of Nureyev. And I thought, well, those two, could dance together, and that would be a real anchor to the project. Well, anyway, this kind of stewed around in my head for a long time, but the urgency was there because the 1990 was coming, and the 10th anniversary was only going to come once.
Had you ever worked on anything at this scale before? Or what kind of gave you the motivation to think that you could actually make that a feasible reality?
Well, I think I always felt I could do things, and if there was some reason to do it, and basically just had to try it. But of course, the right opportunities, that circumstance, and then the opportunity just walked into my life. I was waiting tables at a extremely high end restaurant. I had always doubled back to waiting tables, which is what lots and lots of people do as a second agenda. If you listen to stories of any movie stars and stuff, they'll always go back going, well, I waited tables here and there. And my break actually came in a gourmet restaurant, very high end. There's lots of business conversations going on, not big, high end stuff. And you have to be careful about breaking into those things, but you hear everything. And there were two gentlemen who were talking about the Milwaukee Symphony Orchestra and about pop music. And I politely asked if I could find out what they were talking about. And they said, well, we're planning the summer pop concert series for the Milwaukee Symphony Orchestra. And they looked at me in all seriousness and said, well, what do you think of Madhavani? And I was a rock and roll kid, and Madhavani's, it's Lawrence Welk and, my parents' stuff. And anyway, without missing a beat, I said, rather than answering what I thought of Madhavani, I said, well, what do you think of John Lennon? And you could tell that it clicked right then and there. And the gentleman looked up at me and looked at the other gentleman he was with, and he goes, well, that's a very interesting idea. Well, I had written up a proposal for my own purposes, and I had a copy in my locker at the restaurant. So I ran down the hall, brought it back, and I said, well, here it is. And they said, well, we should get together and talk about this away from the restaurant. So about a week later, we were sitting down and in the symphony offices, at Milwaukee Symphony office, and talking about it. And, the first cards I pull out of my hat, get the ball rolling, is Michael Jackson and Rudolf Nureyev. Of course, the question is, how do you get to either of them? Well, the symphony director, the executive director of the symphony, the gentleman I served as lunch to, and had invited me into this meeting, said, well, I know Michel Sisson, who is the musical director at La Scala, which is the big Italian ballet opera. And she goes, he knows Nureyev. And by the way, he's directing the Nutcracker with the Toronto Symphony in Toronto right now. And I said, well, let's go meet with it. And he goes, well, can you pay for it? And I had this friend who had figured I could tap for that. And I said, sure. So we flew off to Toronto on New Year's Eve. And we got there, and strangely enough, the Canadian Ballet was on strike and the production was shut down. And I really wanted to see it, to be honest. But it also meant that Michel Sisson was not busy. So we had a long dinner, and we discussed, Jackson dancing with Nureyev. And the whole concept of the Lennon tribute in general is the pop symphonic thing we were talking about. And Sisson said, well, I'll see Nureyev. At least I'll see his agent next week in London. I'll talk with him about it. Well, we can go into great detail here, but to telescope it, we got the message back through Sisson that Nureyev would be willing to at least discuss it. Getting to Michael Jackson was a much different story. Like the Beatles, you just don't come through any front door anywhere. And you have to hope you're going to cross paths somehow, and you'll be able to get their attention and not be brushed off. But anyway, so every avenue I thought of to get to Michael Jackson, we got the professional no. And I said, well, look, I'm not going to tell Rudolf Nureyev that Michael Jackson doesn't want to dance with him unless Michael Jackson tells me he doesn't want to dance with him. And I started building a cadre of professionals I knew around me. And I had a concert promoter from a guy named Jim Rissmiller, who was part of Wolf and Rissmiller, which was the promoter of record in Los Angeles at the time. And he had done a favor for a gentleman named Bob Jones, who was managing Michael Jackson's affairs. And so my friend got a hold of Bob Jones, who owed him a favor, and he said, we're being told that Michael Jackson is not interested in dancing with Rudolf Nureyev in a tribute to John Lennon. And he said, well, I'll be seeing Michael tonight at an event that we're both going to, and I'll discuss it with him. And we got the word back that not only was Michael interested, he was thrilled with the idea. And then was the task of getting the two of them together. Without going into all the detail, we eventually got Michael and Nureyev together in Michael's studio in Los Angeles. Nureyev was touring with The King and I. When it reached Southern California was the time that Michael agreed to see him. The story all to itself, the afternoon with Michael in his studio privately. We have photos of that, particularly one I prize, which is of me with my arm around Michael and Michael with his arm around Nureyev and Nureyev with his arm around a gentleman named Bob Woods, who was my assistant at the time. Once I got them together into a room, that was one time in my life I was starstruck. And I just said, look, I'll leave you guys. And Michael said, you don't have to, but I did. So we didn't know what happened until Nureyev got back in the limousine with us. And I said, well, what did Michael say, Rudolph? And he goes, Michael said, I can do it if you teach me. And I thought, oh my God, I mean, that's a quote you see on the cover of Time magazine or something. And I said, well, what did you say to him? And he said, I can do it if you teach me. And I thought, oh my God, this is just, I mean, that's the quote of all time. It's a complicated factor because they both put themselves in a position where one had to ask the other, and it was an ego trip about that. But we managed to get through that. But anyway, the phenomenal thing is the day after the meeting, and we sent Nureyev on to go join the camp, the King and I cast, and we left Michael behind and for that meeting. And I got a phone call from somebody, and he said, oh, you must be excited about your story in Variety magazine. And I said, what story in Variety magazine? He said, well, Paula Abdul has announced she's going to choreograph the dance between Michael Jackson and Rudolf Nureyev. That's how pervasive this already was. Now there's TMZ and all of that stuff. So all of that stuff gets covered. This year, you're talking about 1989. So nonetheless, we had locked in the idea that Michael Jackson and Rudolf Nureyev would dance together in a modern pop symphonic tribute to John, choreographed by Paula Abdul, who at the time her album Straight Up was, top of the charts right then and there. So that's how things started to come together. And I had a relationship with Sid Bernstein, who brought the Beatles to the United States in 1964 to Carnegie Hall, which is a wonderful story. Which I tell in the manuscript. Eventually, Sid and I are traveling from London to Liverpool, and we discuss the details of how all of these things in his life came together. So you can read about it in my Beatles story. While we were putting this together with the symphony, well, I talked to you about Michel Sasson. Well, in between the Toronto meeting and him going back to Europe and talking to Nureyev's agent and reporting back to us, we had agreed that we'd meet up again in Manhattan a couple weeks later. And so, again, the executive director of the Milwaukee Symphony and I flew to New York. We were going to meet again and have lunch with Michel Sasson and Gary Good, the musical director of the symphony, and I. And at the last minute, I thought, well, maybe we should invite Sid Bernstein to this lunch. And I thought, really, just because he could tell us great Beatles stories. Luckily, Sid was available and made his way across Central Park and joined us for lunch. And of course, he regaled us with stories. But it started, the light went off again, which is now it wasn't just me and the musical director from the symphony. It was Michel Sasson, the three of us, and the light went off going, oh, Sid's the answer at all this. He knows all these people. He's worked with people that knew John. And I asked Sid, well, how would you go about doing this? How would you get, this together? And he said, well, we should just go talk to everybody who knew John. It's an easy thing for anybody to say. He can say it because that's not out of his realm. Well, he had inspired the entire concert industry. He was the first person to put a rock and roll band to a classical music stage, like, the Carnegie Hall. Now everybody plays classical music stage. He was the first person to put a rock and roll band into a stadium at Shea Stadium. And it was only because he and Brian Epstein wanted to find a place to put more seats in front of the Beatles. And now everybody plays stadium. So Sid really is due a lot more respect than he's done. But nonetheless, I said, okay, Sid, well, how do we go and talk to everybody that knew John? And he said, well, the Madame is happening next week in Cannes, which is on the south of France. And it's the annual mega world conference of the record industry, particularly publishing. So he said, well, everybody's going to be there. Let's go start this there. And of course, I had this, fairy godmother, father, angel, whatever you want to call this gentleman, who said, I'll keep paying for this if you can keep finding, keep it moving forward. So we flew off to Cannes. Keep in mind, I had to tell the chef at the restaurant I worked at, I can't serve dinner Saturday because we're flying to Cannes. And of course, I never ended up coming back to work after that. But so we get to the Madame. I meet up with Sid. I fly to JFK, and he is to meet me at JFK to fly on to Nice, France. And he's not showing up, and he's not showing up. And the planes, there was calling the board, and finally I see him, and he's a large man. So just for him to run through an airport is quite a sight. And he's got this box of these bright blue, almost fluorescent blue papers, and some of them are flying off the top. You can see it's right out of the movies. And he gets there and he goes, well, I'm late. I had to pick up these leaflets at the printer. I'm going, leaflets? And he goes, yeah. Don't forget, Thomas Paine was a leafleteer. You guys can all check your history for that one. But I'm going, oh my God, I just talked my friend into 2 round trip tickets at the last minute to France. In those days, you paid heavy for last minute tickets, and we're going to be leafleting, just basically saying we should all come together to honor John. Sid said, go, just go enjoy yourself. So I went out and I met a guy from Chrysalis Records. So he asked me what I was doing. So I'm here with Sid Bernstein, and he goes, Sid Bernstein. He said, oh my God, that's all we're talking about. Because it's Sid, we'll do anything he wants us to do. And of course, Sid's saying, well, what do you want to do? Sid and I went from New York to London, basically to scout things out. And jet lag, you just sit there watching television. And in those days, English television was, particularly overnight, was horrible. But they would keep doing this little news update about what was going on. And one thing they kept saying is Paul McCartney is getting his Lifetime Achievement Award at the Battis Awards the next day at a luncheon at the Grosvenor Hotel. And I'm going, okay, Sid, that's obviously our next destination, in this unplanned quest to put this together. Well, here we go again. How, as an outsider, are we going to get in? That's like trying to get into the Grammys. I mean, you don't just walk in. We get to the hotel, and there's a table in the lobby where you check in. And so I walk up with Sid, and I said, this is Sid Bernstein, presented the Beatles in the US. And we had just flown in from New York. We had just heard about Paul getting his Lifetime Achievement Award. And we certainly would have gotten tickets, if we had known in advance. But here we are. And is there any way we can get it? And I walked up, and the woman goes, oh, yeah, well, look, I have 2 tickets that haven't been picked up. And I think I could give you those seats. They're not great seats. They're about towards the back, and I'm like, yeah. And it's like, give me the tickets before you realize the con job that I'm laying on you. There was no con. I really meant what I'm saying, which is this is the man who presented the Beatles in New York, and it would be great if he could attend Paul's, Lifetime Achievement Award and maybe meet Paul if Paul is interested. So we get in there. what's interesting about this hotel is the lobby is at street level, but the ballroom is one floor down, and there's a grand marble staircase that goes down. So we're down there, and necessarily, and of course, Paul and Linda and the kids are all up at the central table. And at one point, as luck would have it, Linda and one of her children have to go up the stairs to go to the bathroom. So I watch them walk up, and I grab Sid and I go, "Follow me." And we walk up to the top of the stairs. And what are we doing? And then I said, "You stand right here and don't move." Because I knew Linda would have to walk right by it. And of course, it worked perfectly. She's coming across the lobby, and it's big Sid. So we walked down together, and she goes, "Oh, Paul will love to see you." And of course, I'm going to this exactly. So we walk up to Paul. Linda's like, "Oh, you need to sit with us," and there's no seats anyway. And Paul is like, "I don't think so." I'm sure he knows that every time he's approached, something is going to be offered and asked of him and whatever. And certainly that was on our agenda. But at least we had met, and then we went back. And by the way, the place was full of Mark Knopfler and Dire Straits and George Michael, and it was whatever was big that era in British music was there.
You just met a Beatle for the first time. So you said you were starstruck with, Michael Jackson and Nureyev. What did it feel like to be in Paul's presence? Did he feel larger than life, or was he making you feel kind of?
Well, yeah, to be honest, keep in mind, this is 10 years after the Cambodian boat refugee reunion, so Paul knew who I was. Let me put it this way. I presumed he did. And he gave me a look like, "Oh, so you're the guy." I may be reading everything into this, and at one point Linda said, "Oh, Paul, Sid, I need to give you our phone number." And she took out a piece of paper and started writing it, and Paul put his hand right on top of it.
Yeah.
Like, no.
That's aggressive. That's very aggressive, the way that was written down. So that's where I wondered, because you were associated with Sid, if there was anything between Sid and Paul from a previous.
Well, two interesting things that come from this. I went there with Sid to hopefully lock in Mccartney. And without that, we were just basically back in this room of fascinating people. And like a balloon deflating, or, a carnival packing up to go home, once the thing was over, people were leaving and there were people lingering. And to my amazement, kind of as the clouds clear, across the room is George Martin. And I'm like, "Oh my God." Absolute stepping stone in the process to a Beatles tribute. Our modus operandi was, let's go meet everybody who knew John. Well, there's George Martin. And I said, "Sid, when was the last time you saw George Martin?" He said, "I've never met George Martin," which is even more incredible. So I go up with Sid and I go, Mr. Martin, this is Sid Bernstein. And of course they connected instantly. And Sid was good at small talk conversation, and then he would he would create a moment and just give it to me. And this is what he did. He was chatting with George. He said, "Oh, we're in town. We're exploring a tribute to John Lennon. Would you have time to sit down and talk with us while we're in London?" And George's immediate response was, "How about tomorrow at my office at Chrysalis? And 2:00, and of course it was, I immediately went, yes. He's one of the three men, I call them the three magicians, or the three magic men. First and foremost is Brian Epstein, who, had the foresight to see their potential and shepherd them. And really his most important move was to shepherd them to George Martin. That was exciting. So the next day we go to Chrysalis Records, and right out of the movies, this gorgeous man, elegant man, George Martin, walks down to greet us. He comes down from he didn't send his secretary, say, "Come send him." He comes all the way down, greets Sid, and we go back up, and we're in his beautiful office, of course. Said, "Look, we want to do a pop symphonic tribute to John. Here's how we envision it." And I walked him through the elements of the show as I could see them at this point. And Martin loved it. You couldn't script this better, but he instantly said, I'm in. I will compose a special symphonic piece for this, and I will conduct the orchestra. And he said, I will also issue all the artist invitations, and I'll send them to everyone that knew John, with the exception of Paul. For some reason, he sent it Paul. He didn't say Paul shouldn't be invited or anything like that. He just said, I'm not the one to invite Paul. You'll have to figure that out on your own.
Ringo's fair game, I guess.
I mean,
which is really interesting because, yeah, George Martin hadn't really ever done a tribute that I'm aware of at this time. He did that, I think, in the late 90s. He did a disc of kind of producing cover songs from famous artists and, covering Beatles songs. But maybe he looked for that outlet. What's notable to me is so far everyone you've engaged, I mean, now you're getting really into inner circle of Beatledom, and nobody's saying that's too painful, I can't do that, right? It seems like 10 years, as you said, is the right amount of time where they're actually, like you're saying, George Martin is actually embracing the idea of this tribute, that it's the right thing to do.
Oh, everyone we talked to embraced the idea. Yeah. There was not a single no from anyone. Well, eventually there was, but
not yet.
But the point was, yes, I mean, it was if somebody was waiting for someone to bring it together. Well, there's one other step to this trip to London that I need to tell you about, which is, keep in mind the mission that Sid set was, let's go see everyone who knew John and ask them what they want to do. Almost as an afterthought, we're in London and we're getting ready to go home the next day. And I don't know if it occurred to me or to Sid, but we learned that Cynthia Lennon had a restaurant called Lennon's. Sid and I agreed that we're not going to solicit Cynthia Lennon for a Lennon tribute, a tribute to John. It just didn't seem to make sense considering the divorce and John's relationship with Yoko, and didn't make sense. However, it did make sense to come to London and not see her. And since she had a restaurant, she was accessible. I mean, it's not like we're knocking on her door at her home somewhere. And we get to the address, and outside the building is a neon sign. It says Lennon's. There's the eyeglasses, his signature eyeglasses are in a different color of neon, and they're figuring out it was Lennon's Rock and Roll Bar. And the circles of the eyeglasses were the O's in rock and roll, I think. Anyway, but what was the telltale sign was that it was flickering and falling apart. And it was my first image that maybe things aren't all that elegant. And we looked through the window, and there's Cynthia sitting not at an elegant white linen tablecloth, but at a Formica table in what would be like a submarine sandwich shop, like a Subway, in a strip mall on America. And you could see on the back wall, it was a walk-up counter where you got your sandwiches, and this huge, menu board with sandwiches made in the Beatles lyrics, like, the yellow submarine sandwich kind of thing. But nonetheless, she was beautiful. And, as you just look at any pictures at any age, we went up to her and she recognized Sid. And keep in mind, Cynthia was on the trip into New York in '64, the first trip to America. You can find her in some of the pictures here and there, but Brian made a point of keeping her hidden as much as possible. So she knew Sid from 1964. So this was a genuine reunion. And we didn't jump into the tribute. We were talking about how she was doing. And I mean, this is really a conversation between Sid and her. And she was with her longtime partner at the time named Jim Christie. And I was just delighted to eavesdrop, and then of course Cynthia asked why we were there, and Sid said we're pursuing a tribute to John, and we're talking to everybody who knew him. And we may have even said something like, we're not here to ask you about that because it, obviously wouldn't seem appropriate. And she jumped right in and said, no. She said, I would love to do a tribute to John. I still love him, no matter, I will always love him. and I haven't had a chance to say goodbye. And the Beatles, the remaining Beatles, owe him a performance. Same thing George Martin said. And then she said the most profound thing. I really think John is in spiritual limbo because the world has not let him go. But that was the profound thing. But anyway, we left with Cynthia on board, and it was on the trip home that we got notice that I don't know who it's interesting. I'd have to find out who the letter went to, but there was a letter from Peter Schukat, which is Yoko Ono's attorney, and it was a cease and desist order, and it said your pursuit of a tribute to John Lennon is essentially unauthorized. I mean, where do you go after that?
Do you think, yeah, on that point, do you think there's anything about the way that this concert was being planned that rubbed Yoko the wrong way or led to this, or just the fact that there was anything that was not, she was not?
Well, I think it's probably both. Keep in mind, she could have done this anytime in the last 10 years or anytime she chose to. And it was only that it was happening, I think, that it came to her attention. And I don't think it was this, I think, we didn't make the professional step to ask for permission from her. And I didn't think we needed it. I thought John was a possession of the world.
Was that something that you or Sid were planning at some point? Because it seems like you were nearing the point where you would be reaching out to Yoko after, around the same time as Cynthia and the other inner circle.
Well, to be honest, first of all, I have extensive history with Yoko Ono from 1979.
That's true, yeah.
It's amazing, as I look back, that I didn't feel obligated to go directly to her. I think it was, things were left in 1979 with, I had to collect all the pieces before coming back to her. And that's what we were doing. Then she had set on the gauntlet, to cease and desist. And then she announced that she was going to do her own tribute in Liverpool 6 months earlier than Cynthia's, which wasn't even on the birthday of John's birthday. Why would you do something 6 months before John's birthday?
I don't know.
Except to upstage the efforts we were doing.
Sabotage? I'm not sure. But I do wonder also, I'm not a lawyer or anything. Like when you got that, did you have to seek legal counsel in some way? Or was there any effort to potentially combine the tributes? Or was it always going in these two separate directions from that point on?
Well, actually, now that I think about it, we didn't get that letter on my trip home from the first meeting with Cynthia. I'd have to look at the sequence of the timing, but Cynthia was in with us when we got the letter. I think that really put it over the top, probably. But I think what happened is Yoko started seeing the kind of people that wanted to do this, and she thought, well, if they're going to do it, they should do it for me. But as the story goes on, we were in New York. Cynthia traveled with us to New York. Julian was performing at the Beacon Theater for his Mr. Jordan tour, so it was that album. So that's when Cynthia knew she would meet with Julian, which she did at the Plaza Hotel, and Julian said that he would support the tribute, on behalf of honoring his father, but as to support his mother, who was now a producer, a de facto producer. We never put titles on anybody. We were just a group assembling this stuff. And then, of course, she was going to go to Julian's concert that night at the Beacon. And of course, Sid and I were going to go with Cynthia. And of course, Jim Christie was traveling with her at all times. So the four of us were a team. And so we were going to go to the concert. But Jim Christie reports back to me. So obviously the meeting between Cynthia and Julian was private. But Jim Christie telephones me after the meeting to give me the news that, yes, Julian will support the project and perform. But amazingly, that Yoko has invited Cynthia to cocktails at the Dakota before going to the concert. Now you have to understand what that means. First of all, Yoko, you know, usurped her marriage. I mean, it may have been time. I mean, it was certainly a decision by John and Yoko, but nonetheless, that was the reason that her relationship with John ended. And the divorce settlement left her with very, very little. And she had the responsibility to take care of her son. And keep in mind that Cynthia was a college student when she married John. And she was there for the hard times. She was there for Hamburg. She was there for all of it. But Yoko had tried, according to Cynthia, Yoko had tried to entrap Cynthia many times into a photo opportunity so that it would look like they were pals or that there wasn't any animosity. For Cynthia to decide that she would enjoy cocktails with Yoko Ono in the Dakota, in the apartment where the two John and Yoko famously lived, and they were raising their son, Julian's stepbrother, is amazing. Now, keep in mind, she had to walk across the steps where John bled to death to get into that building. You have no idea the lengths that Cynthia would go to hide her movements, because every time it would be known she was going to have dinner particularly in a New York restaurant, Yoko would show up with with a camera, not a film crew, but she was going to make, and that Cynthia was not willing to give the world that false sense that there was camaraderie between the two of them. The reason Cynthia agreed to go there, this was after the cease and desist order, and she went there to ask Yoko to say, look, let's put this behind us on behalf of our sons, and let's do this together. Let's do this as the Lennon family. Let's do a Lennon family tribute to John, particularly because it brings their brothers together. Yoko invited Cynthia to have lunch at the Russian tea room the next day, and they were going to talk about it further. And that's where it was when the concert happened. Now, the concert was fantastic. We're in the Beacon Theater, and so we were sitting on the right side of the stage, front row, the four of us, Cynthia, Jim Christie, Sid Bernstein, and myself. And Yoko and Sean were sitting halfway back on the left side. Not only was she invited for free show cocktails at the Dakota, but that Sean was going to sing with Julian during the concert. And I'm like, oh my God, this is the family, this is the reunion. This is this is it. This is, I mean, not the Beatles reunion, but this is the Lennon family reunion. I knew that the press was going to catch on to things, and that the reason people have publicists is you try to organize how that happens. So I called the Associated Press. Actually, Jim Christie said, well, what do we do now? And I said, well, you call the Associated Press. So I called the Associated Press, and they said, it's too close to the concert. We can't get this together. Sorry. And right at that point, I was at Sid Bernstein's house at the time when Jim called. And Sid Bernstein's son, Etienne, who was a teenager at the time, his youngest son, came in and said, oh, the buzz is all over New York. Atlantic Records is throwing a party for Julian at the Hard Rock after the show. And I'm going, oh my God, well then Cynthia, Yoko, Sean, and Julian are going to be together there at the Hard Rock. So I knew this before Cynthia went to cocktails with Yoko. So I said, Cynthia, you've got to make sure Yoko and Sean attend the after show concert party at the Hard Rock. And then I called the Associated Press back and said, look, the Lennon family is going to be at the Hard Rock together. First time ever. And he says, oh, well, we have enough time to get photographers there. So we're at the concert, and Julian is performing, and he's kind of moving back and forth through the show, like coming up to the right side and playing for his mother, and then going to the left side and kind of playing for Yoko and Sean. And he gets to a point in the concert, he goes, well, I have a special guest in the audience, and he's never been on stage before, but if he would just come up here now. And of course, he walks up, and some of the people realized it was who it was. And then this wave of recognition started coming through. So everybody's I'm thinking, and I imagine everybody's thinking, well, what are they going to play? Is it going to be, this Beatles song or that Beatles song or this solo song or Beautiful Boy, or what are they going to sing? And they sing B.B. King's Stand By Me, which had been on John's 75 rock and roll album. And of course, it just tore the house to the ground. So now the concert's over. We're backstage with Cynthia and Julian. And Julian says, go take my limousine and go to the Hard Rock. I'll meet you there. So we go to the Hard Rock. So Cynthia is seated at a table, coincidentally, right below George Harrison's one of his gold platinum records, which I thought was kind of interesting. Julian, of course, comes up to greet her. And suddenly there's this strobe effect of cameras going off in the darkness. Well, then John comes over to join Julian and Cynthia, and the strobe effects starts going higher. Well, anyway, out of the darkness, dressed in all black, in her wraparound black glasses, is Yoko Ono. And she comes up, and now the cameramen realize what's just about to happen, which is that Cynthia and Yoko are going to be together with their sons for the first time ever. And you could not see in that room. There was the strobe, the lights going off was just psychedelic. Anyway, so things settled down, and we were all together, and Sid and I joined the table from the other side, and maybe that set Yoko off. I don't know, and I can only speculate. The whole thing's over, and we're on our way back to taking Cynthia back to the plaza. And I said, well, what's happening? I said, well, Yoko leaned over and canceled the lunch at the Russian tea room. So the War of the Widows continued, where my point to all of this is the overture was clearly that Cynthia walked over the steps where her husband died and went into the place where John and Yoko famously had made their new home and raised their new son, and all to make the very reasonable suggestion that the two collaborate. I mean, Cynthia had the whole thing together. Yoko just had to join and say, okay, but Yoko decided she was going to do, shortly thereafter, she announced her own project. Right. And it was going to be a tribute to John Lennon at the Pier Head in Liverpool. She convinced the city of Liverpool to pay for the improvements to the property. They had to create an area that could be enclosed that would hold 100,000 people. I was sitting at home, by this time, I think we were pretty much realizing that, first of all, money was running out. And, well, we found out that we had set up a meeting with ABC Television to pay for Cynthia's version of the thing. But that Yoko had gotten to them first and said, no, I've got the rights to this and everybody's going to do it for me. And, so everybody, it was just one thing undermining, but nonetheless, Yoko's event went on. And I remember the fax machine. That was our international form of communication in those days. I remember the fax machine starting to peel out this thing, and I went to look, and it was a London Times review of Yoko's concert in Liverpool on May 7th, I believe, of 1990. The headline, which was "Instant Bad Karma at the Mersey." That was the title of the review of the concert. The way they reviewed it is they took the whole show and they said, this artist doing this Beatles song wasn't the worst. And then they went to the next artist and said, this artist singing, this specific Beatles song. They went through the entire show, and then the Liverpool Symphony performing I Am the Walrus. Well, that was absolutely the worst.
Right.
So that's how the story of the 1990 tribute to John came to an end. And you can make your own decision as to why it ended and didn't happen. But life being what it is, it could be understood that maybe it just wasn't the right time yet.
So what you're saying, Perry, is that since John Lennon's friends chose not to perform for Yoko in Liverpool, perhaps because, they had previously offered to perform in the tribute to John when Cynthia first asked them to, there's still an opportunity for a true superstar tribute to John style concert to be held, where his friends could still perform, Eric Clapton, Jeff Lynne, of course, Paul McCartney and Ringo, like they did for Concert for George. And because as we know, Paul and Ringo did not actually perform in Liverpool for Yoko's tribute, choosing instead to just send videos that could be played for the crowd. And then, of course, Michael Jackson, Elton John, and David Bowie all turned down Yoko's invitation, too.
What I'm putting out here and what's suggested in the manuscript, a tribute to John was never meant to be owned by anyone. It was the world to come together to celebrate a man who said, imagine no possessions. But it can happen and it should happen. And I'm hoping the manuscript and these conversations we're having will find an audience.
It's also around the same time, I think it was maybe 88, when the Imagine movie that Yoko puts together is released. I mean, Aunt Mimi is still even alive. I think she passes away in December of 91. So was there anyone else in like the family or anything that you approached? His sister?
Well, we didn't think there was much further to go than Cynthia.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm just wondering, once you're in Liverpool, I mean, there's got to be so many. In 1990, everyone from that time a lot of them are still around.
Well, interestingly, when Sid and I went to Liverpool because he remained friends with Barbara Epstein, which was Clive Epstein's wife and Brian Epstein's sister-in-law, but it was Clive and Brian were brothers. Clive and Barbara had a son named Henry, and he was Henry Brian Epstein. Now you be an 18-year-old kid carrying the legacy name of your uncle. One time I saw Sid Bernstein literally weeping. I mean, weeping was as he sat in front of a fireplace with Barbara and reminisced. And I was far enough away that I didn't think it was something to eavesdrop on. So I was in the back, and Henry Brian Epstein showed up, which was, I was in my 30s, but at least this was roughly in my age group. And he said, would you like to see some of my uncle's memorabilia? I mean, come on. You really have to ask that question. I said, sure. And so we went up to his room, and he said, well, we used to have a Brian Epstein museum, but that closed down. So I have all of it. He opens this armoire, this antique thing that used to be a closet that would stand freestanding. He opens it up, and it literally tumbles out piles of memorabilia. And sitting right on the top are two about quarter-inch opaque white, supposedly like clear plastic, but you couldn't see through it. And they were the acetates from the Beatles at the Hollywood Bowl. But anyway, there was a photocopy of the Beatles' second management contract, and I said that would be nice. And so he gave me that, and then there was a copy of Brian's autobiography, A Cellar Full of Noise, and he gave me that. This wasn't a business trip. For me, it was a pilgrimage. I'm going with Sid Bernstein to Liverpool, for Christ's sake. And the first place we're going is Clive Epstein's home. We then had an appointment to go see Queenie Epstein. What was interesting is on the train ride from London to Liverpool, Sid told me the story of how he booked the Beatles for Carnegie Hall. He tried to convince his bosses to book the Beatles. And the reason Sid did that is that he was taking a night course at NYU, and they had to read a British newspaper every day as part of it. It was an English history thing, I guess. I don't know, whatever. He tried to get GCA to book the band. And they called their London office, and the London office said, it's a flash in the pan, forget about it. So, of course, that's what the message Sid got was, no, we're not going to do it. Well, Sid went out on a limb, and he told his secretary, he said, get me Brian Epstein on the phone. Sid told me, he said, it was actually Queenie Epstein that was on the phone. And Brian lived with Queenie. And Sid says, I remember we spent a lot of time talking about the New York Times book review until Queenie realized how expensive an international call was. And she says, oh, I'm running up a big bill here. I need to get in. And he said, I could hear these footsteps coming down the stone-like stairs. And she goes, well, here comes Brian. And so Brian took the call. I tell you this background for a reason. I'll tell you at the end. But so Brian took the call, and Sid said, I want to book your band in the United States. And Brian said, well, that would be suicide because we don't have airplay or record sales in America. So that would have shut down anybody. But Sid says, oh, then I'll book them a year from now.
I would like to kind of fast forward and talk about, you going to that Paul McCartney concert with Cynthia.
We were in London. It was the last night of multiple shows in London. It was the last night of the European leg, and it was before the beginning of the North American leg. But nonetheless, I got the assignment to get the tickets. And Sid just flew in from the Madame, and we were together in the hotel. And this is when I had my first morning breakfast or something with him. And I said, oh, Cynthia wants to go to Paul's concert. Can you get some tickets? He said, well, that's interesting because I just flew from the Madame with Tony Barrow, who had been the Beatles publicist and Paul's publicist. And at the time he was working with Paul. And Tony said that the show is totally sold out. Everyone in the world is trying to get tickets. So Sid finally got a call from Tony Barrow. There were 2 tickets at will call. Sid, of course, assumes he's going to go with Cynthia. And I'm going, well, Sid's not the businessman in steel. There's no way he's going to take the opportunity to try to get Paul to, although he's gone to great lengths to try to get reunions. But I was concerned that if I wasn't there, I wasn't comfortable with things moving along. So, and I knew that Cynthia would be expecting to take Jim Christie with her. And she was the one who got the tickets. So there is a line that looks like the line to the arena itself, and it's the line to the VIP pickup. It hits me that Cynthia Lennon is standing in line to pick up tickets to go see Paul McCartney. Like she should have to stand in line, But right out of the movies again, I no longer found Cynthia and Jim and just started saying hello when this hand from outside the screen comes in front of us and goes, Cynthia, come with me. This obviously Paul had sent this guy to find Cynthia. And I said, well, we need to pick up tickets. You don't need tickets to Cynthia. And then as we're, I said, well, I'm going to go see if I can scalp a ticket and get in. And he goes, no, just follow us. The magic again, so, and we go through and we just follow me and we go and we end up on the floor of the arena. He then says, well, don't sit down. Paul wants to see you. So we make our way back and we go underneath the seating. If you've ever been backstage in an arena, then somebody else comes from a hallway and goes, Cynthia, follow me. And then we start going, she says, no, Paul wants to see you alone. And so she goes off. And so we wait half an hour, 45 minutes, whatever it is. And Cynthia comes back. She goes, you won't believe what I've got. And it was VIP after show passes. So we went and watched the show. So the thing's over. In front of us is the circus tent. We come in, Paul and Linda are greeting everybody as we come in. And, George Martin came over and said hello to Cynthia. And Cynthia went and talked to Paul. And I asked what happened, and she said, he'll think about it.
And reading that, it's almost like fan fiction, which I know it's not. I guess my question was going to be, was a formal offer ever extended, either then or after the fact? It sounds maybe like it was still feelers, right, at this point.
Oh, no, Paul. I mean, people offered to participate more than we asked anyone to participate. Obviously, by accepting a meeting with us, they knew why we were there. You know, Paul certainly knew Cynthia's commitment to the tribute and Yoko's opposition to it were now private knowledge in the industry. So
Right.
for people to go any further supporting Cynthia was taking sides against Yoko.
Sure. Right. Exactly.
And
we haven't touched on the Klaus Voorman meeting, right? So you spent a couple days with him in Germany, and that was a huge driving force as well before the
Yes, well, this was part of the now you've sparked a memory of the fact that we did go on quite aggressively for a while. Anyway, but our publicist had lined up all sorts of international press to interview Cynthia. And and one of the people that she interviewed was the German press corps. Keep in mind, this is 1989, the Berlin Wall had just come down. Or this was already in 90, nonetheless. It was right after the wall had, that Eastern Germany had opened up, East Berlin had opened up. And so the press corps said, well, we're the first to reunite the East German and West German press corps, and we're now united. And they interviewed Cynthia. And then the next day, we were at the Plaza Hotel, and the maitre d' comes in and says, we were at the restaurant, one of the restaurants, and the maitre d' said, there's a gentleman here that wants to see you very badly, Cynthia. And she showed him in. It turned out to be the guy from the German press corps. And he said, you won't believe this. We went to press with our interview with you about the tribute. And the children of Berlin have started a letter writing campaign. The tribute to John must come to Berlin, because the Berlin Wall went up in 1961. So they have all been behind the wall since before the Beatles, before all of 67, all of the revolutionary music. Therefore, if you're going to do this tribute to John, you should bring it to Berlin. Now the challenge is, how do we get the Brandenburg Gate at Berlin? Well, it turned out to be much harder than we thought. But so Sid Bernstein had a friend that was at the United Nations, and this might be the link between the Kampuchea and the animosity to Yoko and all of it, because there was a guy from the UN who must have been involved in all of that. He became our aide, and he was hard to define what his position was at the UN, but he was up there. And he said, well, we went to him and said, I went to Sid and said, how do we get to do a concert in Berlin? And he brought this guy out from the UN. He said, well, you need to get Willy Brandt to endorse the project. And I knew that Willy Brandt had been the chancellor of West Germany when Kennedy did his Ich bin ein Berliner speech, and that he had gone on to become he was the West German mayor when that happened. Then he went on to become the West German chancellor, and he won the Nobel Prize. And so we get a notice back from this guy that Willy Brandt will see us in Cairo on a certain date. And I'm like, well, I'd love to go to Cairo, but why in the world are we going to see Willy Brandt in Cairo? We eventually get together with Willy Brandt. He agrees to co-host the event at the Brandenburg Gate. We get photos, But while we're in Berlin, Cynthia gets a call from Klaus Voorman. I don't know why. I would imagine because she's now becoming fairly well known or it's just a complete coincidence. I don't know. But they're old friends from the days in Hamburg. And yes, there is a long, wonderful story here. So Klaus wants to, reminisce and invites her, therefore us, to come to he owns a bed and breakfast in Kiel, which is north of Hamburg. So, we head back from Cairo, we go to Berlin to do our business with Berlin Philharmonic, which finally replaces the Milwaukee Symphony. And a big step up there, by the way. And then we go on through Eastern Germany, driving through Eastern Germany to Kiel, and we spend 2 nights with Cynthia reminiscing with Klaus Voorman. The punchline is I didn't realize how important. I mean, I knew he was the artist for the Revolver cover, but I didn't realize how deeply involved he is in the lives of the Beatles. He could have anchored this whole thing. And to this day, I would hope, by the way, I have a graphic of his, of John on the cover of the manuscript. He still could be the anchor to pull this together.
Totally agree.
Horst Fascher, who was one of the club owners, I think he owned the Star Club. Yep. So he came to meet with Cynthia and Klaus, and then Cynthia left to go meet Astrid. God, I wish I would have gone along on that one. But she went and met to meet Astrid, and while they were doing that, Klaus and Horst, who had brought his baby, and Horst had a baby, and Klaus had a baby, and they went pushing their baby buggies. And Jim Christie and I, Cynthia's partner, are walking behind the two. It's like a scene out of The Godfather. The two of them are in front of us, pushing baby buggies through this high grass, a little pathway through the high grass, and we're behind them. And Sid and I look at each other and going, "Here are the two titans of radical Reaper rock and roll, pushing baby buggies through the grass, and here we are walking with them."